Imperative means this is what they must do, and this is what they want to do. Okay. And this is what they tell us, and this is what they don't tell us. Well, sometimes they're actually very clear. Oh, we're going to do whatever it takes to save the banks. But they save and bail out the banks in the name of stable banking system. All right, let's see where we have. So, I already mentioned monopoly. One of the things is monopoly privilege for or of banknotes. So that's one of the main tools for the central bank to accomplish removing the limits is they must eliminate all competing currencies. That's the one thing. The second one is the power of law. You have to use the law. The central bank uses the law to regulate other banks. The central bank uses the law. In other words, if that's what I was explaining last time, if the banks get together and try to organize and try to cartelize, there will be always one or two banks willing to cheat and profit from the agreement. So when you get 10 banks together, if they all agree on something, there's always one or two banks that would like to cheat and profit from the agreement. This is what we see with OPEC all the time, when all OPEC countries want to lower production of oil, the supply of oil, drive the price significantly higher. But guess what? As soon as the price is higher, any OPEC country wants to pump up a lot more oil and profit from the higher price. But if 1, 2, 3 of them decide to profit from the higher price, they push the price lower. We call this cheating, okay? And in OPEC, nobody can enforce the cheating. That's why OPEC doesn't work, can't work. It's always prone to failure. It's exactly the same on the competitive markets with commercial banks. You get 10, 20 banks, no matter what they agree on, there's always the temptation to cheat and profit at the expense of all the others. Well, they have done this over and over historically until enters the government, and the government uses laws and enforces the cheating. Okay? All sorts of cheating, they're called regulation. The regulation's purpose is to keep banks from cheating and using free market techniques to profit from it. Okay? Again, to profit one bank at the expense of all the others. So, the goal when we use the law is that the banks all profit together, not at the expense of each other, at the expense of the people, at the expense of households. Households get impoverished as a result of this. So the power of the law will include regulations, which are usually in the form of law, and legal tender law, which requires people to accept the government's meaning, the central bank's money, whether they like it or not, whether they want it or not. All right, let's see what else we have. And, of course, part of legal tender law is issue money. That's the same monopoly privilege of banknotes. In other words, you have the power to print, but you're the only one, and no one else can do it. Okay, that's important privilege. All right, let's see what else we got in here. So the central bank functions first and foremost as the banker's bank. Banker's bank. Commercial banks will maintain deposits at the central bank. They will maintain a deposit at the central bank. That deposit is called Fed funds. That's just the name. It's a weird name, but that's how they call it. Fed funds. In other words, these are funds at the central bank, funds at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will be the U.S. central bank. And these deposits will have a function. The function, the purpose of these deposits is to serve as reserves. Reserves. They'll serve as reserves. Now, how does the central bank make all banks grow at the same time? So, if you're going to grow at 20%, we want you and everybody else to grow at 20%. We're one small family, which we all profit at the expense of everybody else. It's called required reserves. Required reserves. Required reserves. These are reserves which commercial banks are required to keep at the central bank. That's it. So, you got to maintain 10%. You got to maintain 10%. You got to maintain 10%. All commercial banks have to maintain the same required reserves. Okay. Now, the required reserves relative to the assets. Put it far away. I can see them, right? I can keep an eye on those little toys. Yeah, I know. Playing with the phone is a disease. Okay, it's very, very addictive. Okay, a lot of people. It's a whole different thing. They can't stay even for 5 minutes away from the phone. Something may happen. Something would happen and you wouldn't know within 5 minutes, right? You got to be on the phone all the time, right? I guess. All right, so this required reserves is expressed in ratio. So it's called the required reserves ratio. And is usually nicely shortened as RRR, required reserves ratio. This is the percentage of required reserves which commercial banks must maintain at the central bank. The percentage of required reserves. Now, the reserve ratio from last chapter will determine what? The reserve ratio will determine what? Will determine the multiplier. This will determine the multiplier. Now, when we say required, remember how I defined required is the minimum. Okay, now the reserve ratio, if this is the minimum, this determines the multiplier. This will determine in return the maximum multiplier. So, if the required reserves are more than 10%, that's very important to understand. It's actually amazingly simple. The multiplier will be what? What's the multiplier? Less than 10. Correct. Less than 10. Very easy. If the required reserves is 5%, then multiplier is less than 5. And if another example, the required reserves are, what I write here, this is 20 guys. I made a mistake. Now, let's write 5%. Then the multiplier is less than 20. Okay. Well, what did we say, or what is important to understand, and it's used in the textbook, is we say that the banks are loaned up. What mean to loan up? To loan up means to loan up to the maximum. You loan up as much as you can. So you loan up to the required reserve ratio. So what we know is that maximum profits are attained when a commercial bank is loaned up. In other words, profits come from revenues. And revenues come from interest on loans. Okay? So, let's write it up. If loans go up, this means interest revenue go up. It means profit goes up. So, if you want maximum profits, you're going to maximize your revenues, and you maximize your revenues by more loans, by maximizing your loans. So, loaning up implies maximum profitability. Implies maximum profitability for the commercial bank. Okay, that's loaning up. So, what we know is then it follows maximum profitability. Loaning up also means maximum multiplier. So, what this simply means that is the following. If commercial banks want to maximize their profits, they must loan up. And loaning up means that if the required reserve is 10%, they'll multiply at 10 times. Okay? So, essentially, the required rate of reserves by commercial banks choosing to loan up determines the exact multiplier. So, in a competitive banking system with a central bank and the required rate of reserve, a required rate of 10% will equal to multiplier. Sometimes we shorten it. I'm changing now the name to money multiplier, which I wrote last time, right? Money multiplier will equal 10. In other words, the money multiplier will be always less than 10, but in this case it's just going to be equal to 10 as long as commercial banks are loaning up. Okay? And that's the required rate of, and if the required rate of reserves is 5% and commercial banks loan up, the money multiplier will be 20. Okay? So, the money multipliers I'll be explaining very soon, maybe not today, maybe next time, it's at the end of the chapter, determines the money supply, and I'll be getting to that. That's part of it. What's the question? RRT? RRR? Int. Okay, that's interest. INT stands for interest. Rev for revenue. That's interest revenue. Okay. Interest is the amount of money paid for borrowing. Okay. Alright, so that's an important consideration. The central bank, so now we're getting back to where I started and why I started this whole thing is very simple. If the the central bank determines the required reserve ratio, let's say of 10%. This means that all banks will loan up 10 times. Okay? And if the central bank or somehow reserves increase by whatever percentage, by let's say 9%, all banks keep loaning up to the maximum. They will not be losing money to each other because they're all going to be loaned up. And whatever the reserves grow, they all will grow together, we'd say, uniformly. Okay? That's because they are loaned up at all times. When commercial banks are loaned up at all times, they're all at the maximum. Whenever there is a reserve increase anywhere in the banking system, it will spread. The reserve will spread between the 10, 20, or 50 banks. It will spread and allow all banks to grow uniformly. In other words, you can inject reserves in one particular bank, and as I was explaining A, B, C, and D, the reserves will flow to B, to C, to D, and soon enough they'll flow and spread equally to all commercial banks. So no matter what money enters the system, no matter where it enters the system, it will spread between the 5 banks, okay? And then they will loan up that extra reserves jointly at the same multiplier, at the same rate, and not losing reserves to each other. So that's what the central bank is doing with the required reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio ensures that, that's not right, that all commercial banks grow at the same time and don't lose reserves to each other. That's the first purpose of the required reserve ratio. The second purpose is that it simply introduces confidence or improves confidence in the banking system. Say, yes, our banks maintain 10% reserves. We have reserves, we're good, we are well regulated and all the other things. So it's good for confidence. But that's not the real genuine purpose of it. Okay? The real genuine purpose is ensuring harmonious growth. All right.
The money we put in the central bank, can the bank use it?
Again?
Can the bank use it?
Okay.